After my PhD, two men approached me to go on a trip with them to Jerusalem because they did some archaeological discoveries and they wanted me to write about them. And there, I went to a church of Saint Mary Magdalene. And there I saw the portrait of Mary Magdalene that was very different to what I was used to. So she was standing there with her hand extended, with something in her hand, like an egg or a fruit. And she was a very powerful figure on this painting. She was not penitent, she was not in the shadows, it wasn't like a shameful feminine, because I noticed that in traditional religions, very often the feminine is either, like very, very virgin-like, or is kind of pushed to the shadows, ashamed. And she stood there in her full power, with her hand extended, offering some wisdom to humanity. And upon my return to Australia, I started an academic research and spiritual research on that. And I realized that the same posture that Mary Magdalene had in the church, a feminine offering like spiritual wisdom to humanity, was represented in many other archetypes of goddesses in the West. So, for example, there was in Sumer, which is like 4,500 years ago, there was goddess Nimna, and goddess Inanna, and goddess Isis, which is an Egyptian goddess that, many people nowadays relate to. Then they had a very similar story to that of Mary Magdalene. So I realized that this archetype of a divine feminine, of fully empowered, wise feminine, who also claims her erotic powers, was actually always present there, but gradually pushed more and more to the side, right? So this, and then I'm not sure if I should continue or you have another question for me. Because once I start, I love this stuff, right? So once I start, and then I started to look closer into Mary Magdalene. Okay, so there were goddesses who were very similar to her. They were somehow associated, with magical powers, and also associated with the ascent to the spiritual realms, right? And they also always had a partner, So, for example, like it's been denied for a long time in Christianity, but Mary Magdalene, in some sources, was considered the partner of Jesus and his equal. So, for some people, it's super radical, right? So I started to look at alternative sources, but academic sources. And I have learned that, for example, there is something that is actually called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in documents that were discovered in the 19th century in Egypt, but only translated much later. And these documents are as old, like 2,000 years old, as other, documents that are, for example, considered the Bible in Christianity. And then Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the main disciple, right? She actually teaches the male disciples, right? So she's like the goddess of wisdom, which in Egypt and it was called Sophia, the divine wisdom. And in 1945, another set of documents were discovered in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi, which in some of them, over 40 documents, and in some of them, like for example, the Gospel of Philip, she's actually called the partner, which is koinoinos, which means a special or intimate partner of Jesus. So, now like the whole picture is emerging of this very powerful, wise, divine feminine that was present there all the time, and for some reason suppressed or repressed or even ridiculed, right, called a prostitute, into the shadows. And just for historical facts, because I'm an academic as well, I realized that Mary Magdalene was not considered a prostitute until 6th century. Okay, so it's just a medieval edition, just to completely discredit her. Right, so this is basically like the history of my research to Mary Magdalene, and then I discovered that throughout centuries, all different esoteric groups were considered her the wisdom teacher and so on in Europe, which will also pushed to the fringes and often prosecuted because of this belief. So I'm not sure where you want me to elaborate on this.